Am I supposed to start, or are you supposed to do something to lead us off?
Okay. Well, how many of you don't know Jake?
There's a few people here I don't know, so I'd love it if we could go around and say our names. Some of you I know and have in my classes and have gotten to know already, and I'm loving that. But some of you I haven't, so can we just start?
I'm Sabrina.
Sabrina, hi.
And Joseph.
Joseph, okay.
Missy. No.
Missy, I like that.
I made no,
He said Jennifer
I'm never going to live that down.
That's another environmental lawyer.
It's like,
Hi,
really, I need
Jennifer.
to speak up.
The wound in my heart. I'm very sorry about that.
I'm just teasing.
I know.
My name is Ashton.
Hey, Ashton.
Juice.
Hey, Jules. Good to see you again.
Natalie. Carol.
Carol.
And Michael.
Michael, okay, great. Well, I'm Jake Sherman, so it's a pleasure to be with you all today. And you all, you read the chapter.
If not, it's my fault, because I thought I had sent it weeks ago.
Oh.
At least 2 weeks ago.
I haven't.
But I sent it last night.
Okay, well, I won't quiz you. So, okay, so much for the quiz then. The quiz portion of the day will not happen.
But as I said
I got
in
it
the
this morning.
apologetic email,
Yeah.
they'll probably get even more out of it reading it after today's lecture.
Yeah, no, that's great to know. That means I will explain anything that. So the chapter that you'll get a chance to read at some point is a little chapter I wrote called A Genealogy of Participation, which looks at the concept of participation in philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and the transformations that participatory philosophy has undergone over the last 2,500 years. So it's not a tiny little piece. It's kind of, it's not the sort of thing I would encourage myself to write again or anyone to write for a term paper, but I hope that when you do get to it, you'll find something meaningful in it. So what I'm hoping to do in our time this morning is to talk a little bit more about what motivates an answer like participation. If I'm proposing, and some other people that run in our circles are proposing that participation might be the answer to a sort of problem, what's the problem that participation helps us to answer or helps us to wrestle with? What's the question that it helps us to wrestle with? If you look at your sheet, those of you who know me are very used to these things already. Those of you who don't know me, if you take a class from me, you'll find yourself inundated with little handouts of this sort. I won't start by reading you I will start with the epigraph. It's too delicious to skip over. Coleridge, who is one of my favorite philosophers and poets and spiritual thinkers in the Western tradition, Coleridge says at one point, "In wonder, all philosophy began." Now he's quoting both Plato and Aristotle, says that the beginnings of philosophy is in wonder. And when Aristotle says philosophy begins in wonder, it's not, I think, quite as profound as when Coleridge says it. Because when Aristotle says it, he means philosophy begins in wonder. That is, when you're bugged by something itches at you, you don't know. All men by nature, all people by nature desire to know, says Aristotle. It's in us to seek knowledge. There's a kind of infinite quest, a drive for knowledge. That's part of what it means to be the sort of two-legged creatures we are. And when something is unknown and presents itself as a puzzle, we begin to ask questions. So Aristotle says philosophy begins in wonder. But Coleridge goes a little further. In wonder, all philosophy began. In wonder, it ends. And admiration fills up the interspace. But the first wonder is the offspring of ignorance. The last is the parent of adoration. And I put that on there because it's in many ways, what Coleridge is attempting to get at in that aphorism is, I think, something that sums up for me the way I understand philosophy, the way I think the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program understands and approaches philosophy, and also the way I think the participatory tradition, at its most paradigmatic, approaches philosophy. Philosophy not as a quest to achieve mastery over something for the sake of a further kind of dominating power, but philosophy as the cultivation of a deeper knowledge that produces intimacy and relationship with what's known. And the fruit of that kind of knowledge is always to never know the ends of the person, the thing, the object, the concept you're seeking to know. I can think of this in relationship to the people in my life that I love. And those who I live nearest and most intimately with, those who I love most, continually surprise me. The more I get to know them, the more surprising the depths of who they are is. Is that the right conjugation of the verb there? It's this extraordinary thing about, and really it could be about the entire world. Anything that you seek to know, the deeper you dive into it, the more endless its depths become. Meister Eckhart says this about, at one point, he says, if I could just stare long enough at an earthworm, it would provide more knowledge, more wonder, more mystery for me than all the books of the theologians. I am, in one of the hats I wear, I'm a theologian, so I like books by theologians. But what he's trying to say is that anything that you seek to know just opens into this infinite expanse. Now, how to make sense of that is part of what I want to talk about today, and part of what I want to suggest the participatory tradition is able to do. So if you look at your sheet, the way I thought I'd start framing it, if participation provides a semblance of an answer, what's the question? I think the question is what Heidegger called the first and greatest of questions. So I write here, Heidegger thought the most important and perhaps the only really philosophical problem was this: why is there something rather than nothing? This is an extraordinary question, one that presents itself to us as a kind of mystery rather than a puzzle. A lucubratory question. I just threw that in there because I love that word. Lucubration is thinking at night. People like me do our best thinking at night, right? Do you ever have that experience where you wake up and you just start thinking, and it's somehow the darkness, somehow the silence, somehow the presence of the night sky enables you to think different sorts of thoughts than you can think during the day. Rick Tarnas likes to quote Nietzsche, who says, "The world is deep, too deep for day to comprehend." So a lucubratory question, the kind you ask at night when things seem to fall away and you begin to feel the vertigo of being. For others, this sort of question arises in pain or in great joy and exaltation. It's one of the strange things about that I've experienced in life, maybe you have too, that both pain and joy can lead us to philosophize. It can lead, real pain can lead you to ask questions about meaning and ultimacy and significance. And real joy, exaltation, can lead you to the same sort of thing. However the question comes to us, it has the power to transform not only the way we think, but the way all things appear, and so also the way we live and move and have our being. It's also a question that's easy to dismiss. It's not, for instance, concerned with the general existence of just anything, but rather with the real existence of specific somethings. As I write here, particulars, things like carrots, or piety, or Marin County, gravitational waves, Thrasymachus, subtle bodies, maternity, or the Hobbit. These are things that are in our world. And the question of why is there something rather than nothing, it's a question of why is there a world with all these things in it, rather than, as there could have been, a world with none of those things in it, or only one of those things in it, right? A world just of carrots in the Hobbit. In other words, it's a question about the real world. And yet, by the same token, the question's not satisfied if we answer in the way we would normally account for these and other specific creatures, right? So, for example, gravitational waves we explain because of ripples in space-time. Or we say Thrasymachus existed because of 5th century Athenian sophistry. Rather, the question of being, the question of why is there something rather than nothing, asks why do all of these diverse somethings exist ultimately? Why do the totality of things exist rather than nothing. So put this way, you can think about it as the problem, in one sense, of the one and the many, which is the way that the ancient philosophers like to talk about this problem. Why is there, to speak about the totality of all the specific somethings is to use that language of the one, the whole thing, and the many, all the specific somethings, carrots, Thrasymachus, maternity, the Hobbit, etc. And in many ways, the question of the one and the many is the ultimate paradox of being, the deepest and most fundamental question that metaphysics, if you like, is able to ask. It's the greatest challenge, really. Coming to terms with the one and the many is the greatest challenge to any attempt to provide an integral vision of all of reality. So like I said, at many times this is a question that's going to seem really abstract and distant and completely irrelevant to you. Maybe some of you are thinking that right now and are kind of looking at the time. But at other points in life, it rises up with an urgency that can't be dismissed. I give you, on the back of your sheet, not the one with the bibliography, but the third sheet, I give you a set of quotations. I want to read to you from one of them. This is from William James, and I love the way he puts it. James says, first he gives a definition of metaphysics, which I adore. He says, metaphysics means only an unusually obstinate attempt to think clearly and consistently, which I think is kind of funny. But so it's an unusually obstinate attempt to think clearly and consistently. The special sciences all deal with data that are full of obscurity and contradiction. But from the point of view of their limited purposes, these defects may be overlooked. Hence the disparaging use of the name metaphysics, which is so common. To a man with a limited purpose, any discussion that is over subtle for that purpose is branded as metaphysical. Right? You've probably encountered that language sometimes, or you know what he's getting at, right? It's just like, cut it out. I'm trying to negotiate my commute or fix a meal or deal with heartache. Don't raise these sorts of questions at that point. They don't seem to have any relevance. James goes on to say, a geologist's purposes fall short of understanding time itself. A mechanist need not know how action and reaction are possible at all. A psychologist has enough to do with asking how both he and the mind which he studies are able to take cognizance of the same outer world. But then James goes on to add, but it's obvious that problems irrelevant from one standpoint may be essential from another. And as soon as one's purpose is the attainment of the maximum possible insight into the world as a whole, the metaphysical puzzles become the most urgent ones of all. And perhaps the most urgent of all these existential metaphysical puzzles is the problem of the one and the many. Now, I'm going to be focusing, and in the chapter that you've got to look at, the chapter that I wrote, I really focus on the Western tradition of the problem of the one and the many. But I just want to say at the outset, it's not only a Western tradition. Chuang-Tzu, when he thinks about these things in the Taoist tradition, it says, only the intelligent knows how to identify all things as one. Right? Great thinking identifies all things as one. Small thinking, he says, sees them as many. So the problem of the one and the many is something that shoots through multiple traditions. It's a problem that as soon as you start thinking, you will eventually encounter. But there are lots of different ways to resolve it. The great thing about metaphysics, one of the delicious things about metaphysics is usually there's no one right answer. There's no knockdown argument that just says this is the way it is. There are a series of options that can inform the way we comport ourselves in relationship to our world. Now, the fact that there are a series of options makes a lot of people think that it's therefore a kind of tangential sort of knowledge. It doesn't have the kind of rock certainty that we've thought of ourselves as a culture as cultivating, right? We like things that we can prove, that's data-driven, that can help get us to the moon. And yet I think a lot of the most important questions, a lot of the most important relationships we cultivate, a lot of the most important ethical and political decisions we need to make going forward are going to be tied to the sort of metaphysical options we embrace. Not only that, but I want to say at the very outset that it also has deeply spiritual aspects to it. The way you think about these matters, and this is part of what I'm going to develop in terms of thinking about participation, the way you think about these matters, the way you answer these questions depends in part on how you relate to the world, on how you approach the things that you're going to ask questions about, which changes the way they approach you, and changes in one sense who you are. I'm only capable of understanding certain things if I undergo a kind of transformation. And that transformation happens to me, often as not, in the very process of trying to first come to understand them. The world reaches out and has a way of crawling up inside you and transforming you, making you capable of knowing it if you approach it rightly. Goethe says, the eye doesn't see just because it's the eye. Right? Why is the eye capable of seeing? Because the eye is made sun-like by the sun. There's a sense in which the world shapes the organs of perception that we need in order to see it, in order to understand this. And this is as true in metaphysics, this is as true in philosophy as it is in evolutionary biology. We become capable of knowing the world as we make ourselves available to the world to shape us, as we make ourselves available to the energies that form and transform and transcend even the world. Okay, so the problem, back to the problem of the one and the many. What's the problem? As soon as I try to compare beings, as existing, right? As soon as I come out and I say, okay, I want to compare, there's the book, there's that book over there, and there's that coffee mug, and I want to compare both of them under the aspect of existing, I find myself having to affirm two contradictory propositions. Now, philosophers have a technical word for this. They like to call these contradictory propositions aporias. An aporia is just when you end up finding yourself forced to say two things that you can't make cohere with each other. And so the two things that philosophers find themselves saying when they think about things under the aspect of their existence are every single being is similar to every other, right? That coffee tumbler and that book are similar to each other in that they both exist, they both take up space, they both have a certain location. But also, so everything is similar because everything is real. But also, every being is dissimilar to every other being. It's this rather than that. It's that coffee tumbler rather than that book. If I had two coffee tumblers that were almost identical, one would be here, one would be there. If you had two coffee tumblers that were utterly identical, in all aspects, we wouldn't be able to say they're two. There'd just be one. Leibniz calls that the law of the identity of indiscernibles, but don't worry about that. So the distinction in the universe is pretty obvious. When you go out of this room and start your commute home, the distinction between things is something that will be apparent to you. But the similarity is also necessary. Without a common unifying bond between the things of the universe, we wouldn't even be able to assert the differences between them as real. Total diversity. If everything was completely unlike everything else, we wouldn't even be able to think their difference from one another. To be able to think difference, I have to, in some sense, be able to compare. Right? There has to be some plane of immanence on which I can put things and say, this is not that. If they're absolutely distinct, I can't even say this and that in the same sentence. Something has to be able to hold them together. So I need unity even to be able to see diversity. So there are a number of different options for dealing with this. And you can think about these as falling into two different strategies. There's two different initial questions. One's factual and one's explanatory. So the factual question is this: is there really diversity and unity mixed up in the world? Can I continue to affirm both, or ought I to deny one or the other? Because you can take that option. You can say, you know what, it seems like the world's full, shot through with unity and diversity, but actually, all those diverse things, they're not really diverse. Or all that unity is just a kind of fiction. So you could factually deny the apparent presence of unity and diversity. If you choose not to factually deny it, if that option isn't compelling to you, or if you don't find good reasons for that, or if something in your body won't let you do that, then there's the explanatory question. How, if I'm going to take both seriously, how, if I'm going to take both unity and diversity seriously, if I'm going to take both the one and the many seriously, how are they to be reconciled? So let me give you a couple of quick accounts of types of solutions before I move to participation. Obviously, as you can see, I'm stacking the deck narratively. I'm going to give you a series of solutions that I think are maybe not the best before I get to the one that makes my heart go pitter-patter. So, but before I start with the first type of solution, let me point out that this problem of thinking about the one and the many, this problem of thinking about unity and diversity may not have always been with us. In fact, clearly it wasn't, right? We're an evolutionary species. We haven't existed for that long. At some point in the evolution of human consciousness, this problem articulated itself for us. If I had to take a stab, I'd guess that maybe somewhere around the axial age, with what Eric Voegelin calls the differentiation of the partners in being. That is, as we begin to differentiate between divine reality, between human beings and human society, and between the rest of the world, as we begin to feel those differences more articulated, then this problem of the one and the many began to force itself on reflective consciousness more fully. Until that, as long as cosmos and psyche and politeia, as long as and physis, as long as the universe of the cosmic universe, the natural universe, as long as the political, as long as the divine, as long as they're all squished together and compact so we can't distinguish any of them, we're not raising this question of how are these things different. But once we start distinguishing the world into these different domains of being, difference, absolute difference, now becomes something that is one of those questions that itches at you, one of those wonders that Aristotle says is the beginning of all philosophy. So what kind of answers are out there? One answer involves denying that there really is diversity. You can call this monism. Aristotle quotes Xenophanes as saying, looking up at the expanse of heaven, the one, says Xenophanes, is God. So Xenophanes is looking up. And in a sense, looking up is looking away from all the diverse moving things down here to what seems like a stable oneness of the heavens. And the one, says Xenophanes, that's the divine. In its extreme form, monism denies all this multiplicity, all this diversity in the world as just illusion. And it's a spiritual doctrine too. It says it's an illusion that's to be overcome by a kind of spiritual enlightenment. Parmenides, the pre-Socratic philosopher, formulates an argument for this. He doesn't just present it as a vision. He formulates an argument that essentially denies diversity in being. Now there are scholarly quibbles over exactly how to take Parmenides' argument, but the way I read it, it goes something like this. Parmenides says, whatever is being. Right? So what does it mean for something to be, for something to is? It means that it's a being. Whatever is being. If A and B, if two things are both real and yet differ, they must differ by something real. So if that coffee tumbler and that book are both real, there's got to be something that makes their difference real, right? But this too, the thing that makes them different, Parmenides would say, has to be being. It's impossible for two things to differ by what they have in common. They can't be different insofar as they're both real. There's got to be something that interpolates itself between their being real and their being different, that makes them different. Two things equal to the same thing. To differ by what they have in, two things equal to the same thing, would just be equal to each other. If something just is being, and another thing just as being, they'd be equal to each other. I mentioned this before. If they're the same, it's Leibniz's law of the identity of indiscernibles. If they're the same in every respect, if they just are being, then they're going to be identical. And so Parmenides then goes on to say, all things must be one single being. Why? Because if anything's going to differ, it's got to differ by being. If anything's going to exist, it has to be being. If anything else is going to exist, it has to be being. And so the thing that would make them differ is also being, so it's all being. It's all one. And he draws the conclusion, since change is impossible, because it's all being, and since change implies real difference before and after, there can be no change. It's all just being. So becoming is an illusion. Everything is being. And for Parmenides, this was a spiritual insight as well as a philosophical argument. He had a dream in which the goddess comes and shows him, she takes him down beneath the gates of night, and he has this sort of argument revealed to him. What's amazing about that, the reason why I spent a little bit of time on that is to say, at its outset, Parmenides is also looked at as the father of the tradition of argumentation in philosophy. He's the father of logic. So Parmenides but he discovers these logical arguments in the process of engaging on a kind of spiritual quest. Now, I happen to think it's a brilliant argument, not because it's right, but because it drives us deeper into thinking, drives us deeper into the world. I think he's probably wrong. I don't think there's only one thing. I think becoming, difference, change is real. But I also think that there's something that Parmenides discovered about the way the mind can move with ironically, the way the mind can move with the movement of the world and begin to track it in thinking, begin to, as it were, sort of to dance with the inner structure of the world and begin to discover things in that process. So for monism, for Parmenides, for Xenophanes, the great truth is being. The great lie is being is not. The great truth is the one. The great lie is the many. There are schools from the East that come to similar conclusions, although I'd be careful to assimilate them to monism, just like I'd be careful if we were talking about Parmenides more. I'd want to say a lot more about how he nuances this later. But the general thrust of the Parmenidean tradition, the general thrust of the monistic tradition, and of a lot of the non-dual traditions, is to say that what really is being. Okay, so that's one option. A second option would be quasi-monism. Think of this as saying there's one substance, just one substance, one thing that really is, but that substance is diverse. I'll stick with just two examples of it. In the ancient world, the Stoics thought that the world was one great living being. Just one living being, the whole cosmos. And the material world was its body, divinity was its soul. So the material world, all the diverse things in it are part of this one great living being. Later on, in the 16th century, in the wake of Descartes, Baruch Spinoza thought of this in terms of pantheism. He said, Deus sive natura, God or nature, it's the same thing. It's all one. There's one substance, one thing, and all of the particular things, the coffee tumbler, the book, you, me, this building, Hong Kong, they're all modes of existence. Modes, different ways of being that one substance. So it's quasi-monism because there's a lot of difference, but the differences they don't have their own being, they don't have their own substance. The diversity is real, but the modes do not exist on their own or in their own right. I think, I'm a little unsure about this, but I think the sort of process traditions that some of you will encounter during your studies here, the process philosophical traditions, Whitehead, but especially people like Charles Hartshorne or the feminist process philosopher and theologian Sally McFague, their panentheism sometimes is close to this. the world is, the world, actually I shouldn't say that, that's not the case for Whitehead, but for someone like Sally McFague, maybe so. The world is the body of God, she says. The world is the body, actually, not just the world is the body of God, the way that Sally McFague puts it, is the world is the body of God, our mother. Well, what does that mean? It means that there's a kind of, it's like the Stoics, there's a sort of inside to things that is the divine, that is God, our mother. And then there's the world, that is the body. But there's one great being. So you could also flip to the other side. If monism is on one side, you could also flip to the other side. And this is where I think the vast majority of contemporary people who think of themselves as rigorous thinkers oftentimes end up. This is the radical pluralist side. The radical pluralists, far from saying everything is one, say everything is diverse. Everything is distinct. A lot of 20th century opposition to metaphysics can be found here. Engels, of Marx and Engels, famously said that speaking of some sort of hidden foundation of reality is just a philosophical whim. It's a will-o'-the-wisp. It's illusion. The unity we pretend to discover in things are functional, sort of functional unities that we create just to meet our own needs. The technical philosophical name for this sort of thing is nominalism. It's saying when I think there's something that puts things together, right? So when I think that there's a class of things in the world called coffee tumblers, there's not really a class of things in the world called coffee tumblers. It's just that according to my needs, I name a bunch of things that function for me to hold coffee and keep it more or less warm, coffee tumblers. That's fine when we think about artifacts. But what about when you start thinking about naturally occurring things like spiral nebulae or hearts or eyes, right? Are there eyes in the world? Well, radical pluralists would say yes, insofar as we're talking about biology. But if you get right down to it, there's no thing called I. That's not a form, in other words. Forms are just names that we give to things for our own purposes. Empiricists take this view oftentimes. Classical empiricism says nothing is real unless it can be clearly and distinctly observed in some sort of sense impression. I give you a quote there from, I won't read it to you, but I give you a quote from A.J. Ayer saying more or less the same thing, that unless I can perceive it clearly and distinctly with my physical senses, it doesn't exist. And what don't I perceive with my physical senses? Well, one of the things I never perceive is unity, right? What does unity look like? Have you ever touched unity? Have you ever found unifyingness as something you can perceive out here? No. And as far as they're concerned, it's something I project into the world to meet my needs. Now, the correlate of that, think about this, that this can seem really abstract, but I'm going to draw it back in a second, and actually I'm going to start drawing it back right now to some more practical things. Think about this. If the only unity in the world is just a correlate of your needs, then all of your knowing, all of your inquiring, all of your naming can only ever be at the service of your will to power. Right? If it's just a correlate of your needs, if there's no thing that really is lemurs, then any time I start naming things lemurs, it's not a question of me finding out what they're really like. It's a question of naming them to meet my needs, naming them to meet the ends that I or my culture have designed for them. So unless there's something real that articulates its identity, apart from my own need, apart from my own will or desire for it, unless there's something real, then every act of knowledge is also going to be a kind of act of violence, or at the very least, a kind of act of acquisition. If, on the other hand, there is a kind of integrity, a kind of autopoiesis to things in which they shape and maintain their own form, their own intelligibility, then when I seek to know them, my first task is not to say, what can I get from them, or what can my people do from it, or what can my language-using group make of this? But I can actually ask the question, wow, what are you? and wait for an answer. I remember once sitting in a forest with some friends and just staring at trees and just feeling like I knew what my friends were like somewhat on the inside. But these trees, I was in the redwoods 2 days ago with my young children to introduce them to these trees, and just the sense of like these magnificent creatures. What are they? The fact that I can ask that question and not expect that the answer is just going to be what can I do with it is a rejection of the radical pluralist idea that there just is difference all the way down. It's also, I think, a rejection of what I would call quasi-pluralism, which is saying that what something is. Quasi-pluralism is just like there's quasi-monism. Quasi-pluralism is to say, yeah, okay, there are intelligibilities out there. There are stable patterns that things form. But those stable patterns are just generalizations. Those stable patterns just, all there is for me to know about those trees or about lemurs, finally, is just to know the generalization of those stable patterns, what it is, rather than how it is or that it is. And you can see that the effect of this would be somewhat similar to the radical pluralist idea. If in radical pluralism I only ever know something by making up a name that allows me to do something with it, in this mitigated pluralism, there may be general stable patterns out there in something, but whenever I know it, I still only know it according to this generality. And that generality is infinitely repeatable. It's different than saying that there are intelligibilities that make each of you up. There's an intelligibility that is what it is to be you. And as I approach that intelligibility, I then have to be molded. My soul, as it were, to know you, has to become, in some sense, like you for a minute. Not forever. I don't become you. But in some sense, my soul, my knowing, is capable of moving with the pattern in some degree of what you or what I seek to know is. And that's what knowledge might be. That's at least one way of thinking about it that Goethe and Plato and Aristotle found very compelling. So finally, participation. Participation doctrines from the very beginning were an attempt to do justice to the real multiplicity and diversity and the real unity and commonality of things that exist. It's an attempt to think about the intrinsic bonds between beings while also thinking about the intrinsic differences that constitute them as they are. The basic form that it takes isn't just about the differences between things, but involves looking to something higher. So just in the same way that, use the language of transcendence. I want to use the language of transcendence here, but I don't want to pretend that that language means getting away from things. That's exactly part of what I'm trying to resist. I'm trying to find a way to speak about transcendence that doesn't involve it as a maneuver that rejects difference, right? And I think participation doctrines from the very beginning were trying to find that middle space. In fact, they talked about it that way. Plato liked to think about the metaxou, the middle space between heaven and earth, as the place of participation, which he also said is the place in which daimones, spirits, ferry prayers from people to the gods and from the gods back down to us. The middle place is the place in which unity and diversity is held together. So when philosophers thinking in terms of participation think about unity and diversity, think about the problem of the one and the many, they don't deny the existence of a kind of one, which we can imagine, if we wanted to, spatially as sort of transcendent and up, or we can imagine as deeper and more profound. And the idea is that unity is interpreted as participation in some common element or source or principle. When Plato sought to hold together radical immanence and radical transcendence, which he mythologized as the war of the gods and the giants seek to pull everything down to earth, and the gods were seeking to pull everything, to bring everything up to a timeless realm of being. And when Plato sought to unify this war, this gigantomachia between the giants and the gods, radical immanence and radical transcendence, the metaphysical tension and the achievement was reflexively symbolized for him in the concept of participation. When he tried to say, what does this mean to hold these together, the term that emerged for him, the symbol that came forth from his unconscious, as it were, or from his mind, or from his thinking, or who knows exactly how it articulated it, but the term that seized him was participation. Now you can think of diverse forms of participation. In the chapter that you'll read, hopefully at some point, I hope you read it, and I hope you like it, I talk about different stages, different types of participation. When Plato first articulates it, he thinks about this participation as participation in the realm of intelligibilities, which he calls forms, and that we can think of as sort of energetic constitutive patterns of intelligibility, right? That things have. What does it mean to be a horse? It means you participate in equinety. What does it mean to be beautiful? It means that you participate in the pattern of beauty that informs, structures, and shapes this world, but that isn't contained in any one thing in this world. It's not like you can destroy beauty by destroying the beautiful things. Others thought of it in other ways. For Thomas Aquinas, later on, building on certain Islamic philosophies, Aquinas thought that participation was not just in forms, but was also in existence, the infinite act of existing. He even uses, Aquinas says that the right name for God is esse ipsum subsistens, esse being the Latin word for to be. So it's this strange thing. In Latin, it sounds as strange as it would sound in English. Aquinas says that the right word for divinity is to be itself, subsisting. It's subsisting to beingness. Just the radical activity, the dynamic, infinite activity of just being. And Aquinas thinks that we participate in that your being, my being, is a participation in that dynamic, fecund source of infinite being. Hegel talks about a participation in the absolute spirit, which I won't try to go into because I'm sure I would not do it justice, but you can ask Sean about it later. Marx imagines a kind of participation in material processes that inform and structure the things that participate in them. And Heidegger, in the early 20th century, imagines participation in what he calls Sein, being for him. But it's the mysterious, or a kind of mysterious immanence that later on he calls Es gibt. It's the gift. It's there is, or it gives. What does it mean for something to be? It's to participate. Now, for Heidegger, you can't reconcile all of these. For Heidegger, this being, the Sein in which we participate, the it is or it gives, is radically immanent. So it's all part of this world. There's no transcendence for it. It's an entirely enclosed flat plane. For others like Plato, there are sources informing and related to this world, but that exist, as it were, deeper in it or beyond it. There's also a participation in creativity that is less often known, but that I think is deeply important. Whitehead, to some degree, talks about this, but so does a philosopher like Friedrich Schelling. It's the idea that let me back up for a second. I'll get to the creativity in a second, but let me give you one more phrase. One way to think about a radical doctrine of participation is to say that everything about everything comes to it as a gift. Now, that's not to say that everything about everything is really God or is really the one. It's everything about everything comes to it, comes to you, comes to me as a gift. So I only have my being, as it were, because I receive it. I only have from the absolute, from the sacred, use your word, from the divine, from the Tao. I only have my being because I receive it. In one sense, I receive it and it's mine. But I even receive the capacity to receive it, right? It's the gift of being capable of being given a gift is also something I receive. So there's a sense in which I am, but I only ever am through relationship. The other way to put it is I am, but all that I am is ecstatic, literally, meaning it stands outside of me. The very being that I am is something that exists and comes to me from outside of me, or inside at a depth that opens up beyond me. The way Plotinus thought about this is if you go in and in and in, stupendously, amazingly, surprisingly, as I go in, I discover that it opens out and up and beyond. I'm not self-enclosed. The mystery of what it means to be me, the mystery of what it means to be you, and also, I think, really importantly, the mystery of what it means to be anything, to be a tumbler, to be a grasshopper, to be a rainbow, is that as you go in, it opens out. Everything is constituted through that kind of relational dependence. Even, and this is where I think the participation and creativity bit comes in, even our creativity. A lot of times in modernity, we tried to think about, we like to think that we're naturalists, and we like to think that everything sort of functions naturally, except for this one thing, right? Except for the will, except for human creativity. Foucault calls this the image of the human being as an empirico-transcendental doublet, by which he means there's a kind of empirical side of you. Of course we're creatures, of course we're bodies, of course we're part of nature. But there's this thing in you that's not. There's this thing in you that leaps beyond, that's transcendent, that special human thing. Now, I think there is something that in me that leaps beyond determinacy. But it's not something that I have just by virtue of being me. It's not just my prized possession. It's a participation in the creativity of the cosmos and the creativity of the absolute itself. So even my most creative, my most free acts, in fact, especially my most creative, my most free acts, are those acts when I'm still receiving from God, from the universe. Use your word here again, right? Okay, so I want to wrap this up because I know I'm coming to time. I'll say two things. One about horizontal participation and one about participatory epistemology. So this thing about receiving all that I am, receiving it in one sense from the absolute, everything about me, my form, my intelligibility, my existence, my creativity. That is also, to think this way also means to think about my radical relationality to other things. If I'm fundamentally ecstatic in my very being, in the depths of what I am, that is the condition of possibility for me being fundamentally porous to everything else. Why do we exist in a universe in which the flap of a butterfly affects things on the other side of the world, to use the parable that's so often spoken about in this context? Why is the world structured this way so that everything is holistically, holographically involved with everything else? It could easily have been otherwise. You could easily have just had some stuff over there that's completely disconnected from stuff over here, right? Why is it that we seem to be in a universe that's so meshy and touchy? Well, one reason might be, one metaphysical explanation for that, one way of thinking about the intelligibility and the meaning of this might be that fundamentally, I'm never self-subsistent. Fundamentally, I'm never on my own. If I'm fundamentally ecstatic, I'm open at the absolute depth of what I am, and that conditions me to always be substance, yes, to receive the gift of what I am, the being of what I am, but always in relation to everything else. And then to bring this back to to some of the things I said at the very opening, this also changes how I go about living and seeking to know. If the world is constituted this way, if I'm constituted this way, then how is it that I'm to go about knowing anything? Well, I can't go about knowing it just as a subject intending some dead object there. Why? I mean, I can do that, and I can get some knowledge from that, but that's not going to be the most profound kind of knowledge. Why is that not going to be the most profound kind of knowledge? Well, for one thing, I'm not just a self-possessed subject in any sense. It's not that the angle of influence doesn't just shoot out from my brain and my eyes into the world. When I seek to know anything, there's reciprocity involved because of this radical porosity of being. Because anything exists only as participating in that which gives it to be. In seeking to know anything, there's also a process of transformation, a process of change. The subject that does the knowing, the self that does the knowing, the being that I am, is constantly transformed and constantly subject to new pressures, to new formations. It's what we call relationship. And it's easy enough to say that's true when seeking to know you, or my friends, or God, or an animal. But I think that holds true even for the things of the world that we don't think of as personal. I think there's a shaping that happens as we enter into a relationship with them. We're such porous, such malleable beings that in seeking to spend time with anything, if approached in the right mood, if approached with the right demeanor, if approached without the buffers we usually build around ourselves, at least around our modern selves, I become changed in the process. And in becoming changed, and am capable of entertaining other ways of seeing and ways of knowing these things. Now, the upshot of this is extraordinary. If something like this is the case for our knowledge, then that means that the normal way, the mode in which modernity's constructed knowledge, the objectifying, historicizing way in which modernity's gone about saying, this is what we know, and this is the way human beings have always been, needs to be rethought. It's not the case, arguably, that human beings have always approached the world as if through a lens, seen it objectively, and then interacted with it. If human beings, if human subjectivity is itself being transformed through its porosity, through its radical openness to the interiors of the world elsewhere, through the interiors of other creatures, other beings, then much of what we thought in the past that we now look on as superstitious may not have been superstitious. It may have been a different kind of knowing, a different kind of creature that was approaching a different kind of world. And there may be a different kind of world that's still possible if I engage and bring the whole of who I am, my heart, my mind, my body, my soul, into a knowing relationship that seeks not to master or dominate, but as with my very being itself, to receive and to participate and to celebrate collectively with the other creatures of the world. So that's some of what I was trying to get at in my chapter. And that's some of what I wanted to share with you today, though I have to admit I only did about a third of what I was hoping to do. Thank you for your attention, and I can't wait for us to talk together. So what's the deal now? Do we
Well,
have time to chat for a bit before we break?
What time is it?
It's
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock. On the dot. Look at that.
Yeah, that's good. Well, yeah, maybe we could begin with, if there are any just points of clarification and then we can break and then come back for more substantial dialogue.
Great. Can I move this now and sit down? Will that mess things up?
Yeah, that's fine, because I think
Okay.
we're done with the recording. It's very rich.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, you mentioned pantheism and then
Panentheism, yeah.
And I've run across both of those, and I guess I know a little bit more about pantheism,
Yeah.
but could you distinguish those?
Sure. So I didn't say too much about it. I could have distinguished. I think of participatory doctrines, just as a sort of aside, as distinct from either classical theism, pantheism, or panentheism. In part because I think the key, if you're going to, so you don't have to, participation doesn't have to be theological at all. You don't have to do thinking about God. It could be about the absolute or the one or intelligibility or something like that. But if you are going to think about theological questions in a participatory framework, I think one of the keys is to say that if you're participating in God, then God isn't part of the furniture in the universe. So it's not like God's one of the things. You know, if I'm making a catalog of all the things that are, God's not one of the things that I add to that catalog, because the grammar of the word God is that from which all things come. The grammar of the word the divine is that from which all things come. It's not that which sits along all things as part of the furniture of the universe. So now panentheism can affirm that, what I just said. It can affirm that, but it doesn't necessarily do so. Part of the problem with the word is it's not a very old word, nor is it a word that anyone has ownership of. So whereas with pantheism, for example, Spinoza became, for the modern European tradition, the chief example of what pantheism meant. And so then you sort of use Spinoza to say, is something pantheistic or not? The panentheism never had that same provenance to it. So it's a word that is still used in kind of fuzzy ways. It sometimes just means God is not totally transcendent. That is, God is not separate or distant from the universe, as if in these kind of dualistic visions that you sometimes get in the history of thought, you know, where the divine is imagined as something that's incompatible with the universe, and that then justifies what I call, what I sometimes talk about, spiritualities of subtraction or spiritualities of cutting away, right? So like the idea is that if I want to be one with God, if God's something other than the universe, totally other, in the sense of opposed to the universe, then what kind of spirituality am I going to have to embrace? What's going to be something that tries to get rid of all the parts of me that are most universe-like, right? So my sexuality, my body, my being finite, my being temporal, my passions, right? All those things that make me part of this world are things that I need to shed to become divine. So panentheism, in a very laudable way, tends to reject those kind of dualistic theological visions. Then it often says something like, I mean, the etymology of it means that God is in the world and the world is in God. But what does that mean? How do you interpret that? For some, that means that God is one of the things in the world, which I would tend to reject.
What
So-
self-styled panentheist would say that? I'm not
So-
sure if anybody would say that God is one thing in the world.
I think Whitehead does, in that insofar as Whitehead insists that God, or at least Hartshorne does. Whitehead's ambiguous about it, but Whitehead says that God isn't an exception to the metaphysical categories, but their chief exemplification, by which he means that all of these categories of being apply in an exemplary manner to God. Hartshorne said that Whitehead wasn't consistent with that enough, that Whitehead didn't make God enough of a being. And so Hartshorne actually goes on to say God is an actual occasion among other actual occasions. And not only that, God is a society of actual occasions after each other. So it actually makes God just sort of like the biggest actual occasion in the world.
But wouldn't you agree, though, that God is not an actual occasion beside other actual occasions, even though the deep structure of the logic of God as actual occasion is the same as the logic of actual occasions, but every other actual occasion
Yeah.
is in some sense part of the complex totality of God as actual occasion. So in that sense, God is not an occasion beside every other occasion.
But I think for Hartshorn he really is, because as sorry, now this is a little in the weeds, but for Hartshorn, God really is, insofar as God's a society of actual occasions, and as one actual divine occasion perishes into objective immortality, it then becomes part of the collective total that all other actual occasions
So you
inherit.
can see that there's an ongoing rich theological possibilities here, which Jake and I will pursue.
But getting back to your question about panentheism, so I think some panentheists, and I don't mean to say, in saying that some panentheists do this, I don't mean to throw panentheism under the bus, because I think a lot more classical theists do this also, treat God as if God is like, I think a lot of popular piety in general treats the divine as if the divine was one thing in the world, right? So like you imagine God as sort of just this really sort of transcendent Olympian who's part of the mix of things. To conclude, in terms of how to distinguish whether something is panentheistic or not. So one thing is that it would hold together immanence. It tries to hold together immanence and transcendence. But a lot of different things try to hold together immanence and transcendence and don't call themselves panentheistic or haven't. So that might not be a distinguishing mark of panentheism. If there's anything that I think you can say when this occurs, it is panentheistic. So this would maybe be a necessary but not sufficient condition for panentheism. It would be, I'm not sure if it's even necessary, but it shows up all the time. So it's a common condition for panentheism, is to speak about the world as the body of God, so that the world is the body of the divine. Usually panentheistic doctrines want to say that God is passible, meaning that God feels, God's emotional, God changes. I myself am hesitant about some of that language because I really like, I'm really compelled by the language of eternity, not as something opposed to time, but as a deeper, more profound dimension of the real in interaction with time. And I'm not sure that the language of eternity gives itself really easily to language of like feeling, changing, transforming, even though I don't want to think of it as opposed to that. So that's, I mean, it's really heady stuff. Although I think also really profound things in that any of these things can be a puzzle, but I think they're also, the way at least I think about them, they're things that you can live into, and also I would want to caution myself and anyone who cares against thinking that while I think there are probably some better answers to these things, better ways of speaking about these things than others, I also think that the spiritual journey is one in which I certainly have moved through lots of these ways of thinking about them. And it's not a linear progression. I've moved through lots of these ways and then back to others and then back again, and that my relationship to the mystery, or that I'm, in my tradition, I'm happy to call God, is one that that doesn't, I have a lot of positions I'm committed to, but they don't, I don't think of them as determinate or exclusive. There were times in my life when I was very much basically a pantheist, and I deeply needed that as part of what I was undergoing at that time.
But Jake, may I just to give that like a very clear,
Yeah.
if not comprehensive, distinction between pantheism and panentheism, in case that's not clear. Pantheism just says that whatever God is, it's nothing other than everything that
Yeah.
is. Okay, so God, theism, is everything. That's literally what pantheism means. So, and God is not anything other than everything that is.
Yeah.
But it sort of begs the question, what is, right?
Right.
But typically, if you identify what is with the cosmos, then pantheism says that God is nothing other than the cosmos, if that's what is, right?
Yeah.
Whereas panentheism says that yes, God is not other than, God is God includes everything that is, but there is a dimension of God, of the divine, which is not exhausted by everything that is.
Yeah.
So there's something more, whatever that is.
Right.
And it could just be the mystery.
Right.
It could be the void, the Abgrund. It could be the great silence, or it could be a person who's the only true person that somehow is the creator of the universe. I mean, there's many ways of thinking of that. But panentheism, for people who like the term, offers more room than pantheism. But that may not be a fair treatment of pantheism.
Well, and my concern is there's a ton of positions throughout history that haven't been called panentheists. They didn't even know about the word panentheism, and that are oftentimes not included in the lineage of panentheism, but that make that same affirmation that don't. I think the way I read at least the Western tradition is that we got really dualistic around the 14th century. And so in the period from sort of late scholasticism through to early modernity, we just got increasingly dualistic, crazy dualistic. And then I think we read a lot of that dualism back into our history in a way that I don't think does justice to those traditions, which is why I sometimes worry about panentheism, because it's sometimes associated with a very particular lineage that leads up into.
Well, for instance, I think Paul is arguably panentheist.
Yeah. If we can get just a category, if we can just get a sort of analytic category of panentheism, that says God isn't, or the divine isn't dualistically opposed to the world, but also not exhausted by the world, then I'm cool with that. Sean converted me just right now. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is stuff about the oneness and no change.
Yeah.
It never made sense to me.
Yeah.
And I read Parmenides.
Some people never change.
I read Parmenides a long time ago, the
Yeah.
dialogue. It didn't make sense to me. Then the same idea came in Hume and Buddha. That didn't make sense to me either. And I wanted to take one metaphysics course, and part of that course, we had the four-dimensionalism.
Yeah.
And then I thought maybe that's what they are talking about,
Mm.
that there is no change, and actually we do have 4 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the only thing that made sense to me.
Mhm.
But I can't reconcile with this oneness and
Yeah.
no change.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm on your side there. I also don't find I'm not compelled by the oneness, the complete oneness, no change doctrines. And I'm not compelled by four-dimensionalism for that same reason, in that the way I would put it is, so four-dimensionalism is the idea that time is another one of the dimensions, added to the sort of spatial dimensions. And so that what we either exist in a kind of growing block of 4 dimensions, in which sort of a block of space-time that maybe gets bigger as things go on, or maybe it's just one giant chunk that is space-time for all existence, that past, present, future, we're all in this big chunk. I think there are compelling reasons to think that some aspects of four-dimensionalism are true, right? So the success of relativity physics and the fact that there do seem to be time dilations that track with changes in velocity and direction. Those mean that just a pure sort of three dimensions plus one time thing moving on ever forward, it becomes a little harder to hold on to. But even if some aspect of four-dimensionalism is true, you're still making a gamble about what is real when you say that's the real, right? Why say that big block is the real as opposed to my life, right? Or my heartache, or my
angels.
experience tomorrow, or angels, yeah. Which is another thing that doesn't fit easily into the four dimensions, right? So, the Western tradition thought that angels occupy their own kind of time, that we live in a kind of chronos, and the angels live in the evum, which is doesn't track with our kind of time. It's not identical to our experience of time, but it's not exactly the same as eternity either. It's not a complete transcendence of succession and becoming. Instead, it's a different sort of rhythm or temporality or periodization. All of which is to say, I'm with you. I don't know that one should be compelled by monism, and I'm fascinated by people who are, and am happy to have dialogues with them, love hearing from them, and am spiritually inspired by a lot of it. But to my best, as far as my insights go, my best spiritual insights and my best intellectual insights, I'm not compelled by it. So, yeah. Anyone?
How is oneness being defined in that context?
Yeah, so I think we were sort of using oneness there to harken back to a kind of monistic doctrine that would say that all that really is just one without another. And that's a, again, I think I want to be cautious about saying that that's not compelling to me, because there are powerful spiritual traditions that leverage insights like that for real spiritual practice and real spiritual transformation. And when I look around the world, I'm compelled by the value and integrity of things not just being identical. I'm not trying to reject the notion of oneness, though. Like what part of what compels me about participatory doctrines is they're inherently paradoxical. And I think paradox might be one of the keys to the universe. But they say that the oneness is real and the diversity is real as a gift from oneness. Oneness has a certain sort of priority in participatory doctrines for the most part, at least historically. But the many are also real at the same time, which I think is beautiful. Yeah.
I wondered about if the oneness animates the many in a sense, and that could be a panentheism or panentheistic view where there is the ultimate and then there's the realm of the, I guess, non-ultimate that's somehow in interaction with the...
Yeah, that's really, I like that. I like the way you put that. I would think of that as, I think the grammar of participation would fit very well with the kind of way you just described that. If we wanted to get really technical about it, I think grammar matters in a lot of this. I'm a big fan of grammar. I think grammar is really sexy and mystical, and so I wouldn't want to imagine the animation, the oneness animating the many, as it were, as like a kind of line, that you draw from a vein and sort of put from divinity into things themselves. I'd rather think of it as a sort of analogy, a mediation, a different vibration, a different resonance that transforms qualitatively as it is received by other things. So things like metaphor and analogy would become really important for me there. So that I exist, yeah. But my existence it's a finite sort of vibration of existence compared to the existence of the absolute, which is infinite.
Quasi-monism in that sense.
Yeah, well, I guess so. Except that it's real existence. I was using quasi-monism for speaking about sort of modes and a kind of Spinozistic pantheism. But,
Return to it, but
So I had a question regarding going back to participation and the concept of like the reciprocity due to the porosity of each of us, and I understand it, and I think it's very compelling, and I see how me interacting with you would obviously change both, or I and the redwood would
Sure.
both change. But what happens when you get to God, especially if you understand it as this absolute? Is there still that same porosity going both ways, like that reciprocity, or is it more of a one-way thing? Or,
yeah,
especially if it's the language of sort of God the eternal.
yeah.
that's the rub,
That is, although I mean,
theologically.
I have thought of this, but what compels me is so what compels me is this vision of divine eternity that was first articulated, at least in the West, by a guy named Boethius, and Boethius likes to think of eternity not as just everlastingness, right? So it's not just extending forever, but also not as opposed to time. I wish I could. Boethius says eternity is the complete and simultaneous possession of infinite life. And what he does with that is when he thinks about how eternity relates to the things of time, he doesn't think that it's unaffected by it, but that affect is not successive. So here's how you could illustrate it. Boethius thinks that, he thinks that God is eternal, so I'm going to use the God language here. Boethius thinks that God knows all of time, but that God doesn't foreknow anything. So that, and now he thinks this is good for us because it means we're not determined, because it's not like anyone knows ahead of time what's going to happen, because God possesses the completion of divine life all at once. And for Boethius, that means that what God knows is what you're going to do. It's what you do. It's you doing it. And Boethius knows it. I mean, not Boethius knows it. God knows it because you do it. So that in a sense, there's something that affects the divine life there. But it's not like the divine life was one thing and was then another thing. It's just that the divine life is what it is. The divine knowledge is what it is because you are what you are. And so there's a reciprocity there, but it's two different forms of reciprocity. In my life, reciprocity manifests successively in that when we interact, I become something different as a result of our interactions. But in the life of something eternal, reciprocity just is the relationship that it has with whatever it's in relationship with. So in that sense, it's not a relationship of change or a relationship that changes it, but only because it's a relationship that's always already present in the eternal being itself.
So from that perspective, Whitehead, Hartshorne, and the whole process theological tradition would be mistaken.
Yeah, I think they're mistaken.
So do I.
About the divine.
About,
I
yeah.
think they're fantastic when thinking about events in this world, and they. In case you care, like in terms of metaphysics, I'm very compelled by process metaphysics for making sense of finite things, and for a variety of reasons, spiritual and mystical, intellectual and philosophical. not compelled by their theologizing. Yeah.
So, I'm not sure exactly how to formulate the question, but I'll kind of describe it or try to. So, in so considering participation, and then also considering what I've read about Schelling and oops, which page was I on? Access to the absolute. So like knowing and art, making art or revelation as a methodology for knowing.
So can you say, what was that?
Art making
Art
or
making, yeah.
revelation
Yeah.
as a methodology for knowing.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, what kind of orientation should one, I guess, aspire to as an artist to experience that kind of methodology or to be made over by the process of making?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does
Not
make
quite.
sense.
Yeah.
So I would say two things in response to that, and I'd be curious to hear what you think also. My initial thought would be, on the one hand, it's just something that I think happens. So I think it's the right description of what happens in our creative work. So even if I'm not aspiring to be remade in the process of doing creative work, I think I often am remade. And that's both a positive and a negative thing, right? There's a lot of projects we give ourselves to in life that may make us over in ways that are less than helpful for us. And it's being porous creatures isn't just sort of wonderful and warm. It also opens us up to vulnerability and danger and stuff. But whenever an artist or whenever someone engages in creative work of some sort, I think there's a transforming that's happening, and there's a kind of knowing that's happening. And I think that because that's there, we can engage in it reflexively. So we can reflectively engage our artwork or engage our creative capacities in a way that leans into that more fully, and sort of. I think it's an aspect of reflection that it tends to intensify when we use our reflective abilities to open up whatever it is we're doing. It tends to intensify it more fully. And so if I bring a reflective intention to the fact that I get transformed while doing artwork, and seek also to be transformed, seek to know in that process, I think there's all sorts of divinations that can happen in that, and do. I mean, it's. Do you practice any particular form of creative expression that you feel drawn to?
Mm-hmm.
What?
Primarily film.
Film, yeah. My brother's a filmmaker, and I used to think I was a bit of a screenwriter with him, but I now gave that up and became a philosopher instead. But in the process of making a film, I suspect you've probably experienced this, where you don't always know what's going to happen in it, and you discover, but you discover something that's just right in doing it. That sometimes it'll come together and reveal to you what it wanted to be, and that, I think that's a kind of finite illustration of this larger process I'm trying to describe. In that moment of discovering that can sometimes be really transformative. For me as a writer, I oftentimes find that where I'm searching, I don't know ahead of time exactly what I think or how to say it. I think I'm just searching for how to say it. And then in searching for how to say it, something articulates itself in my writing and changes me in the process. So that's what I had in mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I guess what motivates me to ask that question is maybe an inherited perspective of what it means to make art, or maybe one perspective, especially filmmaking, because we're encouraged to know everything ahead of time,
Yeah.
try to know everything ahead of time. And then also, like, I guess it's sort of like this balance that you described. It's not all like acquiescing to things are just going to happen because
Yeah.
I'm playing some kind of role, but it's not all coming from me either.
Yeah, my favorite text on this. So I've learned a lot from a man named Owen Barfield,
Okay.
who probably shaped the way I think about most of these things as much as any other modern author. And he has a really lovely book called Poetic Diction, which is about, it's kind of a philosophy of poetic creation. And I think you could read what he says about poetry into a lot of other arts. And he talks about it not as just, he thinks that at the stage we're at, or at the historical moment we occupy, we're not just supposed to be, or we're not just creatures that are purely inspired, as if I was just a mouthpiece to the artistic inspiration or the muse speaking through me, as it were, channeling through me. But also, if I'm just doing it through my own sort of will and determination, something's missing there, and it can be hard to know how to describe it. Sometimes, I think of it as like just a certain soul is lacking from works created that way. And Barfield says that Barfield thinks that the best poetry in our age is capable of shuttling between reflection and inspiration, never enjoying one without the other, but being so that you're determining the film, you're thinking about the film, but you're also open to the surprises of the film at the same time. And it's a hard, tensive psychic operation to be able to flex that way, to hold both inspiration and reason, determination, thought, and all of that together. But when we do, there's something really beautiful, I think, that happens.
Two people, one directly informing Barfield, as you know, is Coleridge.
Yeah.
If you read Coleridge on poetry, it's just, and Coleridge's definition of imagination, which is basically his definition of the creative act.
Yeah.
What is it? Repetition?
Imagination is, there's two types of imagination.
Oh, yeah, primary and secondary.
The primary imagination is the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am, and the secondary imagination is the repetition in the finite mind of
that's
that
right.
eternal act.
So what we normally call creativity, human creativity, whether it's poetry or making films or just being, present in an artful way,
Yeah.
is a repetition in the finite realm of the infinite act of creation. No, of the act of creation in
Yeah.
the infinite I am.
Yeah.
So you can unpack that just
Forever.
Yeah, forever. It's really beautiful. But Coleridge in his in trying to understand his own creative process and that of William Wordsworth and so on, really brought out the function of polarity
Yeah.
and dynamic sort of dialectical tension in ways that later you'll see Jung doing a lot. With Jung's notion of the transcendent function, for instance, we're bringing together intuition and sensation, thinking and feeling, this play of opposites, in order to give form to the creative upwelling of the archetypal unconscious and so on. The way that Jung describes that, it's very, very close to what Barfield is talking about, and
Yeah.
Coleridge, this romantic tradition.
Yeah.
Mhm. We should probably break and then resume the conversation once we've attended to.
I'll start with you after the
Okay.
break.
Great.